Start. Threats in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, check, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. The checks are: queen to e8, check, queen to g6, check, queen to f6, check, queen to e6, check, queen takes pawn, check, queen to d7, check, queen to c7, check, queen to b7, check. The answer is: queen to e6, check, king to b7, queen takes pawn, check, king to a8, queen takes pawn, check. Next, here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: king to f8, bishop to f1, knight to b4. Let's continue. The threats are: bishop takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, check, queen takes pawn, check, queen takes bishop, pawn takes bishop, rook takes bishop. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check, queen takes pawn, check. The answer is: rook takes bishop, knight to c6, rook to h3, h6, rook takes pawn, queen takes pawn, check, bishop takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: queen takes bishop, queen takes knight, bishop takes knight, rook takes pawn, rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to g5, queen to f3, rook takes bishop. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, queen takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to f4, check, queen to d2, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes rook, knight takes queen, king takes knight, queen to g4, check, king takes bishop. Another one. Threats in this position are: rook takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, knight takes knight, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, queen takes knight, check, queen takes rook, check, queen takes bishop, check. Here are the checks. Queen takes knight, check, queen to g2, check, queen takes rook, check, queen takes bishop, check. The puzzle is solved using: bishop takes pawn, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, check, king to h1, queen takes knight, check, king takes queen, bishop takes queen. Next puzzle. The threats are: knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight to f8, check, knight to e5, check, rook to g7, check, rook to e6, check, rook to e6, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to e6, check, king to g5, rook to g7, check, king to h4, rook to h7, check, bishop to h6, rook takes bishop, check, king to g5, rook to g6, check, king to f4, rook to h4, check, king to e3, rook takes pawn, check. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop to g8, check, bishop to g6, check, queen to f5, check, queen to g6, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen to g6, check, king to f8, queen takes knight, knight to f6, knight to g6, check, king to f7, knight to e5, check. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn, knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn, check, king to g2, rook to g8, rook to h1. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. King to e7, queen to c3, knight takes bishop. Next, the threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: g4, c4, b6, king to c6, king takes pawn. Next, here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. d3. Rook to e1. Knight to d5. Rook to d1. King to f5. King to g3. King to e4. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes bishop. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes queen. Rook takes rook, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to h2, check. Rook takes rook, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. Queen to f3, check. Rook to g2. Queen takes pawn, check. Let's continue. The threats are queen takes knight, check. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen takes knight, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h6. h3. Pawn takes knight. Let's continue. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to b5, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes knight. Queen to f2, check. Knight to e2. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are king takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is a7. Rook to h8. b5. Rook to a8. b6. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes pawn. The checks are rook to h1, check. Solution to the puzzle is king to e3. Rook to d6. d3. King to h5. Rook takes pawn. Let's continue. The threats are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is b6. a6. King to d6. c5, check. King takes pawn. One more. The threats are rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. The checks are queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is h3. Bishop to g3. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. Queen to f3, check. King to g1. King to g7. Rook to d2. Rook to h8. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight to d3, check. Solution to the puzzle is knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes pawn, check. c3. Bishop takes pawn, check. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes knight, check. King to e2. b6. Next, threats in puzzle position are rook takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook to e1, check. Queen to e1, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. Bishop takes knight. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes bishop. Knight takes rook. Rook takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Here are the checks. f3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. f3, check. King to e3. King to h3. Bishop to g3. King to g2. Bishop to f2. King to f1. h3. King to g2. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to d3, check. Rook to d1, check. The answer is rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. h4. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.